We're joined today by Wes Leckrone, a professor of political science at Widener University. Governor Josh Shapiro delivered his budget address on Tuesday. What were your early impressions of not only the performance of the speech itself, but also the priorities that he laid out?
Well, I think, there wasn't a whole lot of surprise necessarily about some of the priorities that he had laid out because this is kind of trickled out a little bit. But I thought, the tone of his speech as he progressed through it was really one of trying to tie together what he called investments to make Pennsylvania more competitive. And he tried to tie together a series of different initiatives, starting most with education, both K through 12, pre-K through 12, as well as higher education and getting an educated workforce. And then moving on into other things, making more economic development funding to help Pennsylvania more competitive to our surrounding states, raising the minimum wage to make us more competitive to the surrounding states, increasing funding to help people in rural areas so that people stay in those areas. So I think one of the big overall themes that I saw from him yesterday was trying to talk about this idea of investments. And, oftentimes these are a list, the budget addresses, or in other states they're called state of the state addresses, are often just lists of things. But he did do a good job, and I was interested in the way he was able to integrate this idea of investment throughout the context of the entire speech, saying that each one of these things that he wanted to do would really help Pennsylvania prosper and become more competitive.
Did the governor propose anything that you think was seen as being particularly innovative?
I thought, and this is a very small thing, but I thought that his idea of the toolkit for digital literacy and critical thinking for school students being developed by the Department of Education to be used in schools throughout Pennsylvania was something that was interesting. All of the other things are, generally when you study these budget addresses and state of the states, they're pretty common across the country, and the topics are pretty common to the political party of the governor. But that was something that really kind of piqued my interest because, one of the problems that we face as a society is an increased kind of belief that maybe democracy isn't working. And Governor Shapiro said, basically, I don't care whether your kids are on the left or the right. I just want them to be able to learn what's real and what's not real and how to think through that process. And when we discuss education, that's a topic on the mind of parents. That's a topic on the mind of educators, and really on the mind of pretty much everybody who cares about democracy. So that was a relatively minor part of his program that he developed yesterday, but I thought also one of the more interesting things that I saw within the context of the speech.
Throughout the prior week, the governor had unveiled various pieces of proposals that were all tied into the budget address yesterday. What do you think about that strategy of kind of sprinkling throughout policies throughout the week to give people an opportunity to maybe digest and absorb those a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is generally a theme that's been done by executives, whether it be the president or other governors throughout the country. It makes a lot of sense, particularly with the cutbacks in state reporters following state politics. It's harder and harder to get the agenda of the governor out to people so that they hear the message of what he has. Not a lot of people necessarily watch the budget address. I mean, followers of PCN certainly are, and, us, the state politics junkies. But when it comes down to it, people get most of their news either through news clips while they're, making dinner or washing the dishes, whatever it might be. And I think the more that he can develop his agenda by making it more public, probably the better off he is to be able to keep hitting home certain themes of what he wants to develop.
Let's talk a little bit about some of these specific proposals. First, the ones that he unveiled in advance of the budget address yesterday. One of them was making a higher education more affordable to some Pennsylvanians within a certain income threshold by merging the state system as well as community colleges together under a united governance. How's that being received?
Well, it's being received because we need to do something fairly well, because we need to do something about particularly the PASHE system in Pennsylvania, right? So we've we've developed a system. There's been some reform within the PASHE system in recent years of consolidating, or I think they call it integrating, a number of different schools. But the problem remains that, these schools oftentimes in rural areas are in areas of declining population. And, they were developed as schools to be able to attract people from the local areas where they're coming from. And they're not able to compete because there's a smaller base of people there. And also the costs for Pennsylvania higher education are going up, as they have in most states. We scholars in this area kind of talk about the idea of the privatization of higher education, where less state funding has been going to state schools across the country, raising public tuition. And, in Pennsylvania's case, that's been more extreme because we, are at the bottom of the rung of states and state funding. So we have, less people, we have non-competitive prices that encourage people to go elsewhere. There are also a myriad, around 100 nonprofit private institutions in Pennsylvania that also give out large amounts of financial aid. So it's extraordinarily competitive. So if this system is going to stay around, the need to be able to integrate all these together and get economies of scale, as well as not competing against each other, right? If you've got a system, it should be integrated as a whole. And, we can talk more about how to integrate the community colleges into that, but just the PASHE systems working closer together instead of kind of, as well as the satellite campuses of Penn State and Pitt. Temple has one or two. They're not quite as big a player in that area, but all this competition needs to be in some way rationalized, and if we're going to continue the system, they probably need to do something about that.
The governor also proposed a 10-year economic development program that includes investment in site development. And he had mentioned that this was the first time, I believe, since the Brendel administration that a governor is offering a comprehensive economic development multi-year plan. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And here's one of the interesting things. This fell into his kind of theme of competitiveness, and the fact that our surrounding states, kind of our competing states of New York and New Jersey and Ohio, had all recently come up with comprehensive economic development plans, which were starting to bear fruit. And that Pennsylvania had been a little bit behind on this, obviously, if we're thinking back to the Rendell administration, that's quite a bit ago. So the idea that we would, develop sites where people could come and move into and have their businesses here, having loans that would then be paid off and recycled into the funds again going forward to the future, is something to make us more competitive as a state. And that fit into his overall message of making us competitive and not wanting, I think he used the word frigging, must be hanging out with John Fetterman quite a bit. I'm tired of frigging losing to Ohio. At the end of the day, he's trying to offer a plan that might make us more competitive when it comes to that. One thing about that plan I also thought was interesting was his kind of reliance on talking about agriculture as being an important part of Pennsylvania's economy. And really, thinking in a way that looks at agriculture as being a technological industry, and that we need to kind of put more funding into that to help to continue to develop that. Part of that is attract investment in the state.
Do you think that certain initiatives were targeted as perhaps benefiting or satisfying one legislative caucus over another, perhaps to be used as a negotiating tool later down the road?
Yes. There's so much in this budget. When we talk about the increases, in education funding and higher education funding and economic development, we're talking about probably putting a lot of stuff on the table in order to be able to negotiate some of it away with what would appear to be, particularly the Senate Republican caucus, that is not in tune with these the spending increases that are involved, within the context of his budget, almost a 7% increase. So, sometimes it's important to be able to put a lot of things on the table so that some of those can be taken off when you actually get to the point of negotiating, which certainly will need to be done. Governor Shapiro was, very much in tune with the fact that he was dealing with a divided legislature. and that there would be negotiations, and then everybody kind of had to come together to be able to reach some kind of an agreement. So, yes, I think the overall, there's a lot of stuff there that could be negotiated out at some point.
Another proposal that was released in advance of the budget address was the governor's mass transit plan. It involved investing roughly $1.5 billion over 5 years in mass transit systems. Do you think this will be a tough sell to lawmakers who are representing more rural areas that may not necessarily have a large mass transit system?
Yes. Over the last couple of decades, there used to be a strong kind of Republican contingency. A lot of this money goes to SEPTA, which is the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, which serves Philadelphia County and then the four, what we call collar counties around that. And there yet used to be quite a few Republicans in Bucks County, Montgomery County, Chester County, and Delaware County. So you could kind of rely on some interest in SEPTA funding there. It's going to be a difficult haul because, that it's seen as, by some Republicans as being a problem that's the Philadelphia area and not theirs. But that doesn't mean that there isn't mass transit in rural areas, and it doesn't mean that it's not important to people who need to get around over, distant spaces to be able to get to the grocery stores, to get to their healthcare providers and various other things. So, there's also the question of whether or not, the perception of Philadelphia as being crime-ridden and problems with SEPTA. The governor was pretty open about saying, that he wanted to push pretty hard for, making it more safe and so forth. So, that probably will be a divide. That would seem to be a tougher sell to be able to get that money, since a lot of it's going to the Philadelphia area.
I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about public education. Last year, the Commonwealth Court ruled that Pennsylvania public schools were underfunded. And then more recently, late January, the Basic Education Funding Commission also released a report calling for more money toward public schools. How much of a role will these two factors play into what gets negotiated into the basic education subsidy this year?
Well, I think, what we saw was that Governor Shapiro went along pretty much with the report from the Basic Education Funding Commission. There was a minority report there from the Republicans, so there are differing opinions on how to deal with what the Commonwealth Court ruling that said that, that it was not equitable and adequate funding system in Pennsylvania. So, this is going to be a point of contention. And I think, from basically what we saw, Governor Shapiro stuck pretty closely to what that majority report said from the Basic Education Funding Commission moving forward. So, a lot of that is moving forward with funding for areas that have traditionally been underfunded, funding more on the basis of need, and, particularly in the realm of kind of upgrading facilities. Some of those things have proved popular across the state. But, you're probably going to see some difficulties between the Democrats and the Republicans who, in general, would like more money for school choice and are, basically blame the cost on the school union, teachers unions, and say that we don't just need to throw money at this problem, we need to readjust the entire system as it exists. So, I think that going forward probably will be some of the contentious, areas that we might see.
Well, as you just mentioned, you suspect some of the Republican caucuses will say money is not the sole fix. What other things are being called for to address public schools?
Well, one is the idea of school choice, right? So while we do have, kind of private vouchers, not vouchers, but tax credits for private schools in Pennsylvania for businesses, expanding a voucher program which would allow people to be able to attend schools of their choice, so they're not beholden to one specific public school. It is, in fact, kind of generally a Republican tenet that, in this area, the idea of choice is important, and people should be able to move with their dollars that are given to them by the state and their local governments for education and not be stuck in failing schools. So give parents the choice. And that's kind of, the Republican, nationally, that's the way Republicans have taken a look at the education, and also just wanting to have far more accountability in the way that money's being spent. So, there's a differing belief on what's wrong with our public school systems and how it's to be fixed. Traditionally, both political parties kind of believed in the public education system over the last 20 or so years. We've seen that split between Republicans and Democrats on how to solve these problems.
The past scholarship program, which has often been compared to vouchers, was blamed for part of the impasse over last year's budget. The governor reiterated his support for this during his speech yesterday. Do you think that that will reemerge? And if so, what does the governor have to do differently to get House Democratic caucus on board this time?
Well, I think a lot of that comes down to negotiation, right? And it's the inside story that we may not see. But I think what ultimately happens is that's the big chip that he puts on the table. Had he not mentioned the vouchers yesterday, and frankly, it was a throw-in line, really. I mean, it wasn't a major part of his discussion about education. So, he did say, that he's it was like almost an add-on to a sentence about how to deal with the education problem. But that certainly is negotiating. If you start with absolutely no kind of bone or carrot to the opposing party, that's going to be a difficult lift. It also shows him to Pennsylvanians to be a person that kind of hears both political parties' wishes on this, and that he would be willing to compromise. I guess the question comes down to whether or not, if the funding is big enough, right? If he gets most of what he wants for basic education funding, it would seem to me that, you might be able to get it through the Democratic caucus in the House to be able to pass this. But, that's gonna take some discussion and certainly a lot of heated debate, I would suppose.
The governor again called for an increase in the minimum wage. He's looking for a $15 an hour minimum wage. This is something he called for last year. This is something Governor Wolf called for all 8 years of his administration. What needs to happen to get Republicans to support this initiative?
Well, again, I think, one thing that the way that he framed this question this time around, I think was interesting. He framed this as being a competitive issue, right? Not, it would help people that need to have their salaries increased. But, he talked about losing jobs to border states, again, the Ohio, New Yorks, the New Jerseys that have raised their minimum wage. And in order for us to be competitive and to help out, rural areas where people were bleeding across the borders, he basically said that we need to raise this wage to keep Pennsylvania workers in Pennsylvania. And, that there's a certain resonance there, I think, particularly given that Republicans oftentimes are in rural areas. But at the same time, I think, post-COVID, there might be some leeway for negotiation on this, because certainly wages have risen for people at the lower rung, and maybe he doesn't get to $15. Giving $15 is really kind of the national Democratic call, right, for minimum wage raises. So you might see something less than $15 just so that the Republicans don't give everything to Shapiro. But the circumstances post 2020 are somewhat different than they have been, earlier on in the Wolf administration.
Being that several minimum wage or typically minimum wage jobs are paying several dollars an hour more than what the current minimum is, does that maybe take some of the impetus out of this being high on the general public's priority list?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard about the fact that people were making more wages, and larger corporations like Walmart and Target and so forth have increased their minimum wage, their personal minimum wage. So it's not as kind of a contentious issue as it was before. And in the overall scheme of what we might develop in the budget, it may be something that is a compromise thing on the Republicans, provided they can reach an agreement on what's good. But again, business isn't particularly in tune with it. But I don't think that they're have as many problems with it as they traditionally have. And it's $7.50 an hour is certainly not the going rate for most jobs in Pennsylvania.
The governor's also putting a focus on mental health funding. This involves programs in schools, community-based programs, county-based programs. Why do you think this has come to the forefront now?
Well, this is really interesting. I mean, I think we've seen a mental health crisis in the United States, and we can deal with that in two ways. One is the schools. We've seen school children and college students a very high rise in the amount of people that are facing mental health issues, particularly post-COVID. Not entirely sure why this is the case, but there are more people in need of services, and that's something that can be provided at the school level. We talked about more funding for that. That's important to parents who are dealing with not being able to pay for it on their own. There's long lines to get into mental health, getting psychologists and psychiatrists. It's very difficult. If this can be provided through schools, that's something that could very much help parents. And the same thing for people in general, that we need to provide mental health services in order to deal with stress of what people are living through right now and the rise in this mental health crisis. So that's something that really appeals to a bipartisan crowd. It's hard to say that we shouldn't help people get out of these very distinct problems, particularly when there are shortages in the mental health care field. That this is something that government, for a reasonable price, could help people out with. It's kind of an issue that most people probably agree with.
The governor's proposing $100 million toward gun violence prevention programs. Why is it gun violence and gun-related legislation in general seems to be a particularly difficult issue to get the caucuses to come to agreement on?
Well, this is one of those kind of cleavage issues around the country whenever you talk about guns. So on the Democratic side, the idea is that we probably need less guns. Republican side is we just need more law enforcement. So I think whenever you talk about the issue of guns, you're talking about a very touchy subject that's got a big salience to a lot of Pennsylvanians. We're a big gun ownership state. And the fear in general is that, any type of discussion about gun regulation or dealing with guns is going to lead to some kind of restrictions on gun rights. And as a consequence of that, it becomes a very thorny issue. But there should be some room in negotiation or discussion about trying to deal with gun violence itself, as long as you don't step on that toe of gun regulation.
The speech itself ran roughly about an hour and a half in duration. Penn Live's Charlie Thompson noted that it clocked in as the longest budget address by a Pennsylvania governor since this type of statistic has been noted, so probably back to about 2005, 2006. And by comparison, Governor Wolf's speeches averaged between 25 and 50 minutes in length. What do you derive about the duration of the speech and also the governor's performance of it?
Well, I knew it seemed to be longer. I didn't realize it was that much longer. It was more akin to a president's State of the Union address than it was probably a budget address or a State of the State. I will say that, when you compare, I do quite a bit of research in comparing State of the State addresses among the country. There are states where people go on for 2 hours, and we tended to be relatively more short than other states. But I think, there may be some method in here from the Shapiro administration in that he has a really comprehensive, he wants to promote a really comprehensive, energetic way to be able to go out and deal with the problems that face Pennsylvania. These are common sense reforms and investments to make us more competitive. So as a consequence of that, I think he, kind of laid out a lot of stuff, particularly at the end, in very short chunks and increments that probably might not have made other speeches. But there's also, in having a longer speech and kind of in dealing with more issues, he was able to raise issues that certain clienteles or certain interests within the state found to be very interesting. So he hit a lot of people. If this is going to pass and we are going to increase funding in the manner that he wants to, you're going to have a lot of players pushing the state legislature to pass a large budget, and then giving out shout outs to a number of different things where he wanted to increase funding allows those groups that support that to then use that in their media to help rally their base to help support the governor's budget. So that probably is why it ran a little long.
There's been speculation that Governor Shapiro may seek the presidency sometime in the future. Were there aspects of his budget address yesterday that perhaps support that theory?
Yes. I think, what really struck me, is how he's trying to position himself, right? So he is in a purple state that is a swing state on many things. And he wants to portray himself as a Democratic governor that can get something done across party lines. And one of the problems that we've seen happen is that Democrats have been losing out on the white working class vote and the rural vote in the United States. And a lot of that's been attributed to the fact that people feel as though they're just not being addressed and their problems aren't being addressed. As you went through his speech yesterday, I kind of saw a model develop of a way that he could help build back some of that working class white and rural support. He did mention rural issues quite a bit. I mentioned the investment in agriculture. He talked about rural health. He talked about the need the workforce, investment in rural areas, particularly the minimum wage. I think that was very important to say that I, as a Democrat, and not just an elite that's part of kind of the the MSNBC crowd. And on top of that, I also thought when he was discussing higher education and education as a whole, he talked about the dignity of all work. And he talked about being tired of having people that I believe he used the example of welders, people that in high school wanted to be welders being told that they're just not college material and how they were looked down upon. And the idea that we need to encourage people to follow their dreams and that being in a trade is a very valuable tool to the society, right? And I think it was that tone of incorporating, kind of working class people and rural areas into his speech that may prove to be a different type of model for a Democrat that could set him apart if he decides to run in 2028 or whatever we might see in the future from him.
In light of last year's budget impasse, do you think that Governor Shapiro and legislative leaders will address this budget any differently or come to negotiations perhaps differently than they had in the past?
Well, it's an election year. So I guess one of two things can happen. Either people can balk at giving each other anything in an election year and then take it to the people, particularly with, the House being so close as we go into the elections in the fall. Or you could have everybody wanting to get home to get into their election cycle and get things wrapped up relatively quickly. I wish I could be that positive. My guess is probably things will get strung out, but they generally are. It's just a question of how long it goes on.
We've been speaking with Wes Leckrone, Chair of Political Science at Widener University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.